I'm going to Andy. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises.
Deputy Director Chen, welcome back.
Yeah.
On an ordinary Tuesday morning at Fort Langley, a young Air Force officer made a choice that would haunt him forever. An elderly woman in a simple blue coat arrived at the command center, fragile, quiet, unremarkable. She carried no credentials, she spoke no demands, she simply stood. The young officer saw nothing but an old woman out of place. He saw weakness, he saw an intruder. He was wrong. What he didn't understand was that the woman before him had spent 40 years invisible, 40 years living 1,000 lives that no one would ever know, 40 years earning the silence that now wrapped around her like armor. She had infiltrated enemy capitals. She had held national secrets so volatile they could reshape geopolitics. She had made decisions that altered the course of history, decisions no one would ever thank her for, because no one would ever know her name. When she didn't respond to his disrespect, she wasn't being weak. She was doing what she always did, disappearing, being invisible, being the kind of hero the world forgets. Then a general walked in, and everything changed. The room froze. The officer's face went pale. In a single moment, the truth emerged, a truth that had been classified for decades. This woman wasn't a mistake. She was a legend. And that young officer had just been disrespectful to one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in American history. But her response wasn't anger. It was something far more powerful. Grace. This is her story. This is the story of a hero no one was supposed to remember. This is what it cost to save a nation while the nation forgot your name. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you were that young officer and you suddenly discovered who she was, what would you feel? Shame? Curiosity? A need to understand how someone so ordinary carried such an extraordinary burden? And one more thing. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. I want to know who's hearing this story. The morning was cold and precise, the kind of morning military bases are built for. Fort Langley's command center stood like a fortress itself, all reinforced concrete and purpose, humming with the quiet intensity of classified work. The year was 2019. 21 years had passed since the Cold War ended, but the weight of secrecy that built this place had never lifted. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was having a bad day. He'd been promoted 3 weeks earlier to Assistant Operations Officer, and he decided that this position required him to be vigilant, protective. In his mind, this meant questioning everything and everyone. When the elderly woman appeared at the security checkpoint at 8:47 a.m. with no appointment, no credentials, and no explanation, he decided she was his first real test.
"Ma'am, I'm gonna need to see your identification and the purpose of your visit," he said, his voice sharp with the kind of importance only a newly promoted officer could muster. He didn't look up from his desk. He didn't need to. He already knew what he'd find. Confusion, apology, maybe tears. An old woman who'd gotten lost. She said nothing. "Ma'am?" He finally looked up. Her eyes were clear, steady, almost amused. She wore a simple blue coat, navy wool, no insignia, no medals, no identification. Her hands were weathered. Her face was mapped with decades of living. She simply waited. "I'm gonna have to ask you to leave the premises," Webb continued, standing now, his voice carrying that adolescent confidence of someone who'd never truly been tested. "This is a restricted military installation, without proper clearance."
Lieutenant Webb. The voice came from behind him like a cannon shot, not loud, just absolute. General James Morrison stood in the doorway of the operations center, and his face had gone white.
Morrison moved forward without another word, crossing the operations center with a speed that contradicted his 68 years. When he reached the elderly woman, he did something no one in that room had ever seen before. He stopped. He stood at attention, and then
His hand rose in a salute, the kind of salute reserved for presidents, for heroes, for the people who'd fundamentally changed the course of the nation's survival. "Deputy Director Chen," he said, his voice carrying decades of weight. "Welcome back." The room went silent. Technicians froze. Junior officers exchanged bewildered glances. Webb felt the floor tilt beneath him. The woman smiled, a small thing, genuine, almost sad. "Thank you, General. I trust the work here continues with integrity." Her name was Sarah Chen, not Deputy Director Chen, a title everyone in that room suddenly realized they'd never encountered in any organizational chart they'd ever studied, not because it didn't exist, but because the files containing it had been classified beyond their clearance level, beyond most people's clearance level. Morrison turned to Webb, and what the young officer saw in the general's eyes was not anger, it was disappointment, the kind of disappointment reserved for someone who judged a book by its cover while standing in a library of secrets. "Lieutenant, you just told one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency to leave the building," Morrison said quietly. "Deputy Director Chen spent 43 years in active intelligence operations. She's been inside 17 foreign capitals undercover. She's passed along intelligence that directly prevented 3 major terrorist attacks. She's held secrets so significant that her involvement in American history will likely remain classified until 50 years after her death." Webb's jaw had stopped working. "And you asked her to leave," Morrison continued, "because she looked like she didn't belong." Sarah Chen raised a hand gently. "It's all right, General. He was doing his job." She turned to Webb. "I commend you for your vigilance, Lieutenant. A weaker security posture would have been a genuine threat. You protected the installation. That's exactly what you should have done." Webb wanted to disappear. He wanted the concrete floor to open beneath him and swallow him whole. But she'd said it with such kindness that it only made it worse. She'd made him a child being corrected by his mother.
Morrison gestured for her to follow him to the secured briefing room, a space so classified that only 3 people on base had access to it. Webb watched them go, and in that moment, something shifted in his chest. He realized that everything he thought he understood about heroism had been incomplete. An hour later, Morrison found himself sitting across from Sarah Chen in the dim light of the briefing room, surrounded by years of declassified memories and the weight of the present. And he began to tell her story. Not because it was time for it to be declassified, but because this young officer, and by extension, all the young officers who would come after, needed to understand what real sacrifice looked like. He pulled out a photograph from 1976. Sarah Chen, 32 years old, dark hair, sharp eyes that hadn't yet learned how to carry the weight of nations. She'd been recruited that summer by a man named Harlow Pierce, a legend in the intelligence community, who'd understood something fundamental. The best operatives weren't the ones with the loudest egos. They were the ones willing to disappear entirely. "She volunteered," Morrison said, his voice steady but reverent. "Not for fame, not for money, but because she understood that some threats were so vast that they required a specific kind of courage, the courage to erase yourself." The story of Sarah Chen's journey into the shadows stretched back 4 decades, and it was about to become the story that changed how a new generation understood the word hero.
Sarah Chen wasn't looking for a career in intelligence. She was a linguist. She spoke Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Russian, the languages of the Cold War's most complex battlegrounds. She taught at Georgetown University for 3 years, living a quiet life of books and coffee and academic security. She was, by all accounts, unremarkable. Harlow Pierce found her in the university library one September afternoon. He didn't flash credentials, he didn't make grand speeches. He simply sat down across from her and said,
What would you do if I told you that the work you're doing here would reach maybe 500 people, but the work you could do elsewhere would protect 5 million? Sarah would later recognize this as the moment her life bifurcated, the moment she had to choose between the comfortable visibility of her world and the profound invisibility of another. She said yes. What followed was 2 years at Camp Peary, though no one would ever call it that. The facilities existed on no map. The instructors had no names, only designations. Sarah learned to kill silently. She learned to crack codes. She learned 17 different ways to identify if a conversation was being monitored. She learned how to lie so perfectly that even a polygraph couldn't catch her. Because her alternate identity would pass any test, she would believe she was that person. But the real training wasn't physical. It was psychological. They broke her, not her body, her sense of self. They deprived her of sleep until she couldn't remember her own middle name. They made her choose between hypothetical versions of herself until she understood that she had to be willing to abandon every part of her identity instantly, without hesitation, without grief. One instructor, a woman named Dr. Helena Voss, pulled her aside after 6 months. "You understand what you're doing?" she asked. They were in a bare room, just 2 women and a fluorescent light. "I'm learning to disappear," Sarah answered. "You're learning to become a weapon," Voss corrected. "A weapon that thinks it's doing good. The question isn't whether you can disappear. The question is, when you disappear, who comes back, and will that person still be you?" Sarah didn't answer. She'd learned that the best operatives understood that some questions didn't have answers. They had only choices. By the end of 1978, Sarah Chen was gone. In her place stood 9 different women, each with their own history, their own documentation, their own psychological reality. One of them would live in Prague, one in Moscow. One would infiltrate the highest circles of the Chinese Communist Party. They all believed they were real, and they all had access to classified information that could reshape world politics. Her name was Eva Novotná. She was a Czech translator who'd fled to Austria in 1968 and had just returned to Prague to live with her elderly mother. She had impeccable documentation. She had a mother who actually existed, a woman Sarah had met twice and who'd been compensated by the agency without ever knowing the true nature of her daughter. The Czechs were looking for Russian moles. The Russians were looking for American moles. And Eva Novotná, a woman with no apparent political allegiance, would get close to Soviet intelligence officers and listen. For 18 months, she attended diplomatic functions. She worked as a freelance translator. She became indispensable. And all the while, she photographed documents. She recorded conversations. She passed information to handlers she'd never actually seen. Dead drops in public bathrooms, messages hidden in tourist guidebooks. Then, in the spring of 1980, something went wrong. The KGB had gotten suspicious. Not about Eva. They checked her thoroughly and found her background clean. They were suspicious about a Russian diplomat named Colonel Petrovich, who they believed might be working for the Americans. They wanted Eva to seduce him, to get him to confess on tape if he was a traitor to the Soviet state. She had 1 week to prepare. Sarah Chen was still inside Eva Novotná, somewhere beneath the layers of psychological conditioning. And Sarah Chen understood that what they were asking her to do would damage this man. Petrovich was innocent. The KGB had gotten a tip from a mafia contact who was settling a personal vendetta. But if Eva Novotná seduced him, if she recorded him denying allegations that weren't true, the KGB would believe he was lying. They would arrest him. They would torture him until he confessed to crimes he hadn't committed. She had a choice. She could refuse the mission, but refusing would blow her cover. She would be extracted, her identity would be burned, and years of work would be wasted. Or she could complete the mission and watch an innocent man be destroyed. For 2 days, she didn't sleep. She sat in her Prague apartment and understood for the first time what Voss had meant about becoming a weapon. A weapon doesn't have the luxury of conscience.
On the third day, she executed the mission differently. She did seduce Petrovich. She did record him. But she also, in a moment of calculated vulnerability, told him the truth. She told him the KGB suspected him. She told him he was being framed. And then she gave him information on how to disappear. Petrovich fled to the west. The KGB never found him. And when they reviewed the tapes, they heard only a man refusing allegations, which confirmed their suspicion of his guilt. They closed the file. But someone had made a choice. Sarah Chen, buried under 9 layers of identity, had saved a man. It was the most dangerous decision she could have made. What followed were 15 years in the shadows. Missions in Moscow, East Berlin, Beijing, Hanoi, and Cairo. She was a translator in one city, a businesswoman in another, a journalist in a third. She had a dozen different apartments, each with a different life. Photographs of families she'd never had, love letters from men who didn't exist, children she'd never birthed. The work was patient. It was about being present. It was about understanding people, not capturing them. In Beijing, she sat in tea houses and listened to Chinese military officials discuss vulnerability in their missile defense systems. In Cairo, she worked as a secretary at an American think tank and photographed documents that revealed Middle Eastern terrorist networks 3 years before those networks became active. She was poisoned once, stabbed once. She almost drowned once during a dead drop that went wrong. But the weapons she'd learned to use in training, the psychological tools, the ability to vanish into herself, these saved her. By 1990, Sarah Chen no longer existed. There was no single person living inside anymore. There were only the characters, and they rotated through her body like possessions through a haunted house. That's when she met James Harmon. James Harmon was a Russian KGB officer, or so everyone believed. She encountered him in Moscow in 1991 during the final collapse of the Soviet Union. He was, to all appearances, a mid-level functionary losing his job as the state imploded. Sarah had been tasked with recruiting him, turning him into an asset of the United States intelligence community. She did her job. She approached him in a cafe, she offered him money, protection, a new life in America, and he accepted. What she didn't know, what no one at the CIA knew, was that James Harmon had been working for the Russians the entire time, specifically to be recruited by Sarah Chen. The Russians had identified her. It took them 13 years, but they'd finally understood that the Czech translator named Eva Novotná, the Moscow journalist named Alexandra Volkov, and the Beijing businesswoman named Li Wei were all the same person, the same American spy, and they decided to turn her. James Harmon was designed to be irresistible. He was brilliant, kind, and slowly, over 6 months of meetings, he became someone Sarah Chen needed, someone she could talk to, someone she could be herself with. And he fell in love with her, the real her. She fell in love with him too, and that was the trap.
In the spring of 1992, he revealed himself. He told her the truth. He was Russian intelligence. She had 3 options. She could run, but they had files on every identity she'd ever used, and they would be given to the Americans, destroying her career and potentially getting her executed for treason. She could kill him, but there were dead man switches. If he disappeared, everything would be released anyway. Or she could come over. She could become a double agent for Russia. The CIA had trained her for every scenario except the one that had actually happened. The one where the mission and the woman became the same thing. The one where sacrifice stopped being theoretical. She had 72 hours to decide. She chose to reveal the trap to her handlers. She reported James Harmon to the CIA. She watched him be arrested and deported, knowing he would likely be executed by his own government for failing to turn her. The last thing he told her as they walked past each other in the Moscow street for the last time was, "You made the right choice. That's what makes it unbearable." By 1998, Sarah Chen had become something more than an asset. She was the most valuable intelligence operative the CIA had ever developed. She'd spent 22 years in the field. She'd prevented attacks, she'd gathered intelligence that had shaped American foreign policy, and she was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with the body. The final mission came in early 1999. Intelligence suggested that a Pakistani scientist named Dr. Khalid Rahman was about to sell nuclear weapon designs to the Taliban. If this happened, it wouldn't just reshape Middle Eastern politics, it could trigger a cascading series of events that would lead to nuclear conflict. Sarah had been retired from active field work for 3 years, officially. She was living in Vienna as a cultural attaché, teaching languages, meeting with handlers once a week, waiting for a retirement that wasn't coming. When they asked her to do one final operation, she understood what that meant. Final. Her identity would be fully exposed. Her years of work would be declassified in her official death report. She would disappear, but not into another role. She would disappear completely. "I'll do it," she said simply. For 6 months, she traveled through Pakistan. She worked her way into Dr. Rahman's circles. She became his confidant, his advisor, his friend. And she waited for the moment when the sale would happen. It came on a Tuesday in June, in a house outside Islamabad. Rahman had the designs in a briefcase. The Taliban's representative had the money. And Sarah Chen stood between them in the only way a woman living 900 different lives could, by remembering that she was human.
She didn't kill anyone. She didn't steal the designs. She did something far more elegant. She made Dr. Rahman understand, through conversation, through appeals to his conscience, through the sheer force of her presence and her words, that this choice would haunt him, that he could be more than a man who sold destruction. And he agreed to give the designs to the CIA instead. As she walked out of that house, Sarah Chen died. Not dramatically, not violently. She simply turned in her last report, returned to Vienna, and disappeared into a carefully constructed retired life. 20 years later, no one would remember her name.
Back in the Fort Langley briefing room, Morrison finished the story as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Sarah Chen sat across from him, her hands folded, her face peaceful. "We gave you the Medal of Freedom in 1999, Morrison said. "Classified, in a room with 3 people and 4 walls. You didn't even attend the ceremony." "I didn't earn it for a ceremony," she replied. "I earned it for something only I will ever know the full cost of. That's enough." The general looked at this woman, this extraordinary woman wearing a simple blue coat, and understood for the 100th time why Harlow Pierce had chosen her. Down in the operations center, Lieutenant Webb was staring at his desk, understanding his entire career differently now. He'd been disrespectful to history, he'd been rude to courage, but more importantly, he'd learned a lesson that would define his career. The greatest among us rarely announce themselves. They walk quietly, they carry their weight invisibly, and sometimes we pass them and never know that we've been in the presence of something sacred. Sarah Chen visited the operations center one more time before she left. She approached Webb directly. "Thank you for protecting this place," she said, and she smiled, that same sad, genuine smile. "In my day, we needed officers exactly like you, officers who protected without knowing why they were protecting. That kind of faith, that kind of duty without glory, that's what kept America safe. Not people like me, people like you." Webb wanted to apologize 1,000 times, but she held up her hand. An apology would suggest you did something wrong. You didn't. You were perfect. And now you understand something most officers never will. Respect isn't something given. It's something we extend to everyone, because we never know who we're really speaking to. As Sarah Chen left Fort Langley that evening, the setting sun caught her blue coat and painted it gold. Morrison watched from the window, and he thought about all the others like her, the ones whose names would never be known, whose sacrifices would never be televised, whose entire lives had been erased in service to a nation that would never know their names. How many real heroes walk past us every single day without being recognized? We live in a world obsessed with visible success, public credit, and viral fame. We celebrate the heroes we can name, the ones with statues and biographies. But the real price of freedom is paid by people we'll never know, wearing simple blue coats, carrying secrets that died with them. Sarah Chen spent 43 years becoming a weapon, then a handler, then a memory. She made impossible choices. She lost love to protect the truth. She sacrificed the visible world so that we could live in it safely. And when a young officer was rude to her, she didn't correct him. She didn't reveal herself. She simply accepted his vigilance as the compliment it was, proof that the system she'd spent her life protecting still worked. That's the real lesson here. It's not about one exceptional woman. It's about the thousands of exceptional people we'll never know. It's about understanding that when we're dismissive, when we judge, when we fail to extend respect to the quiet people in the room, we might be disrespecting the very foundations of our own safety. The question for you is this: how will you treat the quiet people around you? The ones who ask for nothing, the ones who carry their weight invisibly. What if one of them spent their entire life protecting you? If this story moved you, if it made you think about respect, about sacrifice, about the invisible heroes among us, please like this video. Please comment below. Tell me where you watched this from. Tell me what changed in your understanding of heroism. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to do so now. There are more stories like this, stories of courage in darkness, stories of sacrifice that shaped history, stories of people who chose dignity over recognition. Thank you for sitting with Sarah Chen's memory today. Thank you for understanding that the greatest heroes are often the ones we never know. The work continues, and somewhere, someone is still protecting what matters most. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the true history of intelligence operations and the real men and women of the CIA. Their sacrifices remain classified. Their dignity remains immortal.